Sometimes the most dangerous prison is the one that feels like salvation. And when those polite knocks echo through my house on Saturday mornings, my heart still races. Not with joy, but with a mixture of sadness and relief knowing I'm on the safe side of the door. After 18 months that completely changed my life, I discovered that behind those warm smiles and promises of eternal happiness, there exists a reality that few dare to question. Hello, my dear friends. I'm Linda Sue Hartwell. I'm 83 years old today, and my heart is full of stories to tell you. Before I begin this story that changed my life completely, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me such joy to know that my stories reach so many different places around the world. I'm speaking to you today from Bloomington, Indiana, a place that holds both beautiful memories and painful lessons. Today I'm going to tell you how I escaped from spiritual manipulation and found my freedom again when everything seemed lost. This story begins on a suffocating March afternoon in 2001, when I was 65 years old and had just lost my beloved husband Jim after 30 beautiful years of marriage. The loneliness in our little house on Maple Street felt like a weight crushing my chest. Bloomington had always been our sanctuary. We'd moved here when Jim got a job at the university, and we'd built our entire life in this cozy college town where everyone knew everyone, and the autumn leaves painted the streets in golden hues. But now, without Jim's laughter filling the rooms and his gentle snoring beside me at night, the house felt like a mausoleum. I was drowning in silence, questioning everything I'd believed about life, death, and what comes after. Our Methodist church had been kind during the funeral, but the casseroles stopped coming after 2 weeks, and the phone calls dwindled to occasional check-ins that felt more like obligation than genuine care. I found myself talking to Jim's photograph on the mantelpiece, asking him what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. The days stretched endlessly before me, filled with nothing but memories and an aching emptiness that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. That's when they appeared at my door like angels sent from heaven, or so I thought at the time. The older woman, Martha Wilson, had silver hair styled in a way that spoke of careful attention to appearance, and she carried a colorful magazine filled with images of smiling families in paradisiacal landscapes. Behind her stood Helen Crawford, younger but equally polished, with the kind of warm smile that made you feel instantly welcome. "Mrs. Hartwell," Martha said with a voice so sweet it seemed to wrap around my wounded soul. "We're so sorry for your loss. We heard about your husband from the neighbors, and we wanted to offer you some comfort during this difficult time." They weren't selling anything. They weren't asking for donations. They simply wanted to share something that had brought them great peace during their own times of trouble. Have you ever stopped to think about why there's so much suffering in this world? Martha asked, and the question hit me like a lightning bolt. I had been asking myself that very same question every single day since Jim's diagnosis, through his painful treatments, during those long nights in the hospital, and especially during those final moments when I held his hand as he slipped away from me forever. In that moment, vulnerable and desperate for answers that made sense of my pain, I invited them into my home, a decision that would change everything I thought I knew about faith, family, and freedom. They sat on my floral sofa, the one Jim had always complained was too fancy for everyday use, and opened that beautiful magazine to pictures that looked like something out of a fairy tale. Children playing with lions, elderly people dancing in gardens that never knew winter, families reunited in landscapes that seemed to glow with divine light. This is what God originally intended for mankind, Helen explained softly, and it's what he promises to restore very soon. They spoke about a worldwide organization that was preparing people for this coming paradise, teaching them how to live according to God's perfect standards. For a widow lost in grief, drowning in questions about the meaning of suffering and death, those words were like water in a desert. I hung on every word, every promise, every beautifully illustrated page that showed me a future where Jim and I could be together again, where death would be just a distant memory, where all the pain and loneliness I was experiencing would be swallowed up by eternal joy. My personality had always been both my greatest blessing and my most dangerous vulnerability, something Jim had recognized and loved about me from the very beginning of our courtship, back in 1968. I was incredibly empathetic, able to absorb other people's pain like a sponge soaking up water, which had made me a natural caregiver during Jim's illness, but also left me emotionally raw and defenseless after his death. I was fiercely dedicated, throwing myself body and soul into everything I believed in, whether it was organizing church bake sales, volunteering at the local food bank, or caring for Jim during his final months when cancer was stealing him away piece by piece. And I possessed a sense of moral justice that made it impossible for me to ignore suffering when I saw it, a trait that had led me to adopt 3 stray cats, donate beyond our means to every charity that knocked on our door, and spend countless hours listening to neighbors who needed someone to care about their troubles. These characteristics, which had made me a beloved wife, neighbor, and friend throughout my life in Bloomington, would become both my strength and my weakness in the months that followed my first encounter with Martha and Helen. The weekly visits began like medicine for my loneliness, filling the empty hours that had become my constant companions since Jim's funeral. Martha and Helen taught me about this worldwide organization that promised to bring peace and unity among people, based on pure biblical principles, without the human traditions that corrupted other religions. They explained how most churches had strayed from God's original intentions, mixing pagan customs with Christian teachings until the truth had become almost unrecognizable. But this organization, they assured me, had remained faithful to the Bible's pure message, and they were preparing people worldwide for the coming transformation of the earth into the paradise God had always intended. They spoke about an earthly paradise where there would be no more death or suffering, where I would reunite with Jim in the resurrection, where all the questions that plagued my sleepless nights would finally have answers. For a widow lost in grief, struggling to find meaning in a world that suddenly seemed empty and purposeless, those words were exactly what my wounded heart needed to hear. My neighbor, Carol Bennett, who'd been checking on me regularly since Jim's funeral, noticed the change in my demeanor almost immediately. Carol lived in the yellow house next door and had been our friend for over 15 years, sharing countless cups of coffee on our adjoining porches and celebrating holidays together like family. "Linda Sue," she said one crisp October afternoon as we raked leaves together in my front yard. "I've never seen you so animated since Jim passed, but I've also never seen you so different. You seem like you're glowing from the inside, but there's something else there too that I can't quite put my finger on." She meant it kindly, her concern genuine and rooted in years of friendship, but I interpreted her observation as jealousy from someone who hadn't found the truth that was transforming my life. How wrong I was about so many things back then. How blind I had become to the wisdom of people who truly cared about my well-being. The organization's literature filled my coffee table, my kitchen counter, and eventually entire shelves in Jim's former office. Beautifully illustrated magazines that painted pictures of a perfect future world, where lions would lay down with lambs and children would play safely in gardens that bloomed eternally. The publications explained complex theological concepts in simple terms, using colorful diagrams and easy-to-understand language that made me feel intelligent and spiritually enlightened. Each week brought new revelations about Bible prophecies that were supposedly being fulfilled in our modern world. signs that the end of suffering was approaching rapidly, and detailed explanations of how I could qualify for survival into this new world order. I devoured every page, underlining key passages and taking notes in the margins like a diligent student, preparing for the most important examination of my life. The studies gave structure to my grief-scattered days and purpose to my aimless existence. I had found not just comfort, but a mission that made my remaining years feel meaningful and urgent. Little did I know that I was being systematically prepared for a form of mental and emotional captivity that would nearly destroy everything I had once valued about myself and my relationships with others. Gradually, my entire routine reorganized itself around Bible studies and meetings, as my old life slowly gave way to this new, spiritual existence that demanded increasing amounts of my time and energy. The community center on 3rd Street became more familiar to me than my own Methodist church, where I'd worshipped alongside Jim for over 2 decades, and where our wedding photo still hung in the historical display case in the fellowship hall. 3 times a week, I found myself sitting in circles of folding chairs, studying publications that explained how this organization was God's only true channel of communication on earth, the sole source of accurate biblical interpretation in a world corrupted by false religion. The people seemed so loving, so certain of their purpose, so different from the casual Christians I'd known all my life, who treated Sunday service more as social tradition than spiritual fervor. Here, every meeting was filled with passionate discussions about Bible prophecy, urgent reminders about the approaching end of this wicked world system, and detailed instructions about how to live in a way that would qualify us for survival into the new paradise earth. During my 6th month with the group, I began to understand that there were strict rules about family relationships that hadn't been immediately apparent during those first gentle visits from Martha and Helen. A young woman named Rebecca, who had become something like a spiritual daughter to me, was forbidden from visiting her Catholic grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. "It's for her own spiritual protection," the elders explained when I questioned why she couldn't maintain contact with the woman who had loved and cared for her during her most vulnerable years. Association with those who practice false religion can contaminate our pure worship and weaken our resolve to serve Jehovah faithfully. When I pressed for more explanation about how loving your grandmother could be spiritually dangerous, I was gently reminded that questioning organizational guidelines was a sign of spiritual pride, the same fatal flaw that had caused Satan's rebellion against God in heaven. "Linda Sue," Martha said during one of our private conversations, her voice maintaining that same sweet tone that had first drawn me in. "We must trust that those taking the lead know better than we do what's best for our spiritual welfare. After all, they have access to spiritual food that comes directly from God's organization." The warning was wrapped in velvet, but it was unmistakably a warning that further questions would not be welcome. I began to notice how certain topics were completely off-limits for discussion during meetings, how any questioning of organizational policies was quickly redirected or shut down through subtle shame and social pressure. Members who raised concerns were labeled as having independent thinking or being spiritually weak, terms that carried heavy stigma within the community. Yet I pushed these growing concerns aside, telling myself that any organization dedicated to bringing about God's kingdom on earth must know what they were doing better than I did. I was so desperate to belong somewhere again, to have purpose and meaning in my life after losing Jim, that I chose to ignore the growing unease in my stomach whenever I witnessed these controlling behaviors. The cognitive dissonance was beginning to build, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. Instead, I threw myself even more deeply into my studies, spending hours each day reading their publications and preparing for meetings, hoping that increased dedication would silence the doubts that were starting to whisper in the quiet moments before sleep. I distanced myself from old friends who didn't understand my new spiritual enthusiasm, declining invitations to bridge club and book club meetings that had once brought me joy. When Carol Bennett invited me to join her garden club, I politely refused, explaining that I needed to focus my energy on spiritual activities that had eternal value rather than worldly pursuits that would soon pass away. I was systematically isolating myself from every relationship and activity that might provide alternative perspectives or emotional support outside of the organization. Without realizing it, I was building the walls of my own prison, brick by brick, choice by choice, justified by the promise of paradise that seemed to make every sacrifice worthwhile. The transformation was so gradual, so seemingly voluntary, that I never noticed how thoroughly I was being separated from everyone and everything that had once anchored my identity and provided meaning to my life beyond their control. The first major revelation struck me like lightning during my 8th month, when I witnessed firsthand how quickly and completely a family could be destroyed by the organization's policies of social control. The Hendersons had been pillars of the community for over 7 years. David Henderson served as an elder. His wife Susan organized the meal schedules for sick members and coordinated the cleaning of the meeting hall. And their teenage son Michael had been baptized just 2 years earlier amid great celebration and pride. They seemed like the perfect family, the kind of devoted believers that newcomers like me looked up to as examples of what faithful service to God should look like. But Michael had made what would prove to be a fatal mistake during a midweek meeting when the topic turned to the organization's interpretation of a particular biblical prophecy. With the innocent honesty that only a 16-year-old could possess, he raised his hand and suggested that the scripture might be understood differently, pointing out what seemed to him like inconsistencies in the official explanation. The room fell silent, as if he had committed blasphemy, and the elder conducting the meeting quickly moved on without addressing Michael's observation. But the damage had been done. Within a week, the Henderson family had vanished from our community as if they had never existed, not just removed from positions of responsibility or privately counseled about their son's spiritual immaturity, but completely expelled and cut off from everyone they had considered family for nearly a decade. The speed and thoroughness of their removal was breathtaking and terrifying. I learned that Michael's question had been deemed apostasy by a judicial committee, and when his parents defended their son's right to ask honest questions, they too were labeled as spiritually dangerous. The entire family was disfellowshipped, a term I was just beginning to understand meant complete social death. Every person in the organization was forbidden from acknowledging their existence, from greeting them on the street, from accepting their phone calls, from showing them any sign of love or concern. They had become invisible people, cast out from the only community they had known as adults, stripped of every friendship and support system they had built their lives around. I saw Susan Henderson at the grocery store on Kirkwood Avenue just 2 weeks after their expulsion, and the transformation was absolutely heartbreaking. The vibrant woman who used to organize potluck dinners for 20 families and whose laughter had brightened every gathering now looked hollow-eyed and defeated, aged 10 years in 14 days. When she spotted me in the cereal aisle, she approached with desperate hope, her hands trembling as she reached toward me. "Linda Sue," she whispered, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might see us talking. "Please, I need to ask you something. They say this is all for Michael's spiritual good, that completely shunning us will somehow help him see the error of his ways. But how can ignoring a person completely be loving? He's just a boy who asked an honest question because he was trying to understand. How is pretending he doesn't exist going to help him grow spiritually?" I didn't know how to answer her, and the question began echoing in my mind during countless sleepless nights that followed. How could love manifest as complete rejection? How could a God of love require his followers to treat their own children as if they were dead simply for thinking independently or asking questions that demonstrated intellectual curiosity? The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable, creating a war between my heart and my newly programmed beliefs. But I was already too deeply embedded in the community to easily walk away, too dependent on their approval and acceptance to risk questioning their methods. My old friends from the Methodist Church had stopped calling after I'd repeatedly declined their invitations, explaining with growing self-righteousness that I'd found the truth and could no longer participate in false religious activities. I'd grown distant from my sister Margaret in Ohio because she didn't understand my new spiritual path and had even suggested I might be getting involved with a cult. The word had stung when she said it, but I dismissed her concern as ignorance and jealousy. Now, watching Susan Henderson's pain, I began to wonder if Margaret had seen something I'd been too blind to recognize. The organization had become my entire world, my only source of social connection and spiritual meaning, and the thought of losing that felt almost as terrifying as the loneliness I'd experienced after Jim's death. My internal conflict intensified dramatically as the months passed, creating an exhausting war between my natural empathy and the loyalty I felt I owed to the group that had rescued me from despair. How could I reconcile my moral instincts, which screamed against the inhumane treatment of the Henderson family, with my gratitude toward an organization that had given me purpose and community when I desperately needed both? I had sacrificed friendships that had sustained me for decades, alienated family members who genuinely cared about my well-being, and rebuilt my entire identity around this new spiritual life that demanded absolute conformity to their interpretation of God's will. The social and emotional cost of leaving seemed insurmountable, especially for a 66-year-old widow who had already experienced the devastating loss of her life partner. During my 10th month, at a regional assembly held at the massive Indiana University auditorium, where Jim and I had once attended concerts and lectures together, I witnessed something that chilled me to the bone and began to crack the foundation of my faith in the organization's loving nature. An elderly woman I had come to respect, named Grace Morrison, whispered to a small group of us during a break that a young mother named Jennifer had been spiritually disciplined by the elders for seeking professional psychological help for severe depression that had developed after a difficult childbirth. According to Grace, the elders had determined that Jennifer's decision to see a therapist demonstrated lack of faith in God's provision and reliance on worldly wisdom, rather than trusting in prayer and Bible study to heal her emotional struggles. The young woman, who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, sat throughout the 3-day assembly, visibly shaken and withdrawn, carrying her infant son while receiving disapproving glances disguised as concerned spiritual supervision from other members. I watched her throughout those 3 days, noticing how she seemed to shrink into herself with each passing hour, how other young mothers who had once included her in their conversations now maintained careful distance to avoid being associated with someone under organizational discipline. Her husband sat beside her with the resigned expression of a man caught between loyalty to his wife and pressure from religious authorities who claimed to speak for God himself. The sight of this young family being slowly crushed under the weight of religious judgment awakened memories of my own struggle with depression after Jim's death, and how professional counseling had literally saved my life during those darkest months when I'd contemplated joining him rather than facing the rest of my years alone. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, had helped me process my grief in healthy ways, teaching me coping strategies that had enabled me to function again and eventually find joy in simple pleasures like sunrise coffee and evening phone calls with Margaret. The realization that the organization would have forbidden me from seeking that life-saving help, preferring that I suffer in silence, rather than acknowledge that God's supposed provision might sometimes come through trained mental health professionals, sent shivers of recognition down my spine. Mental health struggles were treated as spiritual failures within their community, evidence of insufficient faith or hidden sin, rather than medical conditions that deserved compassion and professional treatment. I began to understand that everything I'd been taught about their love and care was actually conditional acceptance based on complete compliance with organizational demands that often contradicted basic human decency and common sense. The beautiful magazines and promises of paradise were starting to reveal themselves as sophisticated recruitment tools designed to attract vulnerable people like me, people whose grief and loneliness made them easy targets for a system that offered belonging in exchange for intellectual and emotional freedom. The doubt that had been growing quietly in the back of my mind was beginning to develop into something more dangerous to my involvement with the group. The courage to trust my own moral compass over their interpretation of divine will. But I still wasn't ready to act on those doubts, still too afraid of the isolation that would follow if I walked away from the only community that had accepted me since Jim's death. The most shocking discovery came during my 12th month, when I learned about an organizational policy that routinely destroyed marriages and families through systematic manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. The policy centered around something they called spiritual separation, which encouraged believing spouses to leave their mates when one partner began questioning organizational teachings or showed signs of spiritual weakness. I witnessed this devastating practice firsthand when Patricia Matthews, a woman I'd grown close to during our weekly door-to-door preaching activities, was counseled to leave her husband Robert after 23 years of marriage. Robert had begun expressing private doubts about certain organizational policies, particularly their handling of the Henderson family situation, and had stopped attending meetings regularly while continuing to support Patricia's involvement. Rather than encouraging Patricia to work with her husband through his spiritual struggles or suggesting marriage counseling to address their differences, the elders presented her with an ultimatum disguised as spiritual guidance. "Sister Patricia," they told her during a private meeting that she later recounted to me in tears, "demonstrating loyalty to Jehovah by separating from a spiritually weak husband will show your true dedication to God's organization. Your willingness to put kingdom interests above personal desires will be a powerful witness to Robert and may shock him into returning to the truth." The pressure was relentless and psychologically sophisticated, framing a decision to abandon her marriage as an act of faithfulness to God rather than betrayal of her wedding vows. They convinced her that destroying her family was actually an expression of love, both for God and ultimately for Robert, whose salvation supposedly depended on experiencing the full consequences of his spiritual rebellion. When Patricia finally succumbed to this pressure and filed for separation, Robert was completely devastated. I found him after a chance encounter at the downtown farmers market, and the sight of this broken man nearly destroyed whatever remaining faith I had in the organization's claim to represent divine love. 30 years of marriage destroyed because I asked questions, Robert said, tears streaming down his weathered face as we sat on a bench near the courthouse where his separation papers had been filed just days before. I never committed adultery, never hurt anyone, never stopped believing in God, or even stopped believing in most of what they teach. I just couldn't understand why questioning their interpretations of certain scriptures made me an enemy of God, and I couldn't stomach watching what they did to that Henderson boy for having an inquiring mind. He told me about the lonely evenings in their empty house, surrounded by 23 years of shared memories and wedding photos that now seemed to mock his isolation. Patricia had taken their guidelines about separation to the extreme, refusing to eat meals with him, sleep in the same room, or engage in any conversation that wasn't absolutely necessary for handling practical matters. She had transformed from a loving wife into a cold stranger overnight, convinced that treating her husband like a spiritual leper was somehow pleasing to God. The worst part, Robert continued, is seeing how this is destroying her too. She's become someone I don't recognize, someone who can justify cruelty as kindness and abandonment as love. They've turned my wife into a weapon against our own marriage. I learned from Robert and other similar cases that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a common practice designed to maintain organizational control through the systematic destruction of relationships that might provide emotional support or alternative perspectives to struggling members. Families were deliberately broken apart to demonstrate that loyalty to the organization superseded all other bonds, including the sacred covenant of marriage that they claimed to honor. Children were encouraged to inform on parents who expressed doubts privately. Spouses were taught that their primary allegiance was not to each other, but to the organizational structure that claimed exclusive authority to interpret God's will. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty, turning the most intimate human relationships into instruments of control and punishment. I began to understand that I wasn't part of a loving spiritual family, but rather a complex system of surveillance and manipulation that used people's deepest needs for belonging and purpose to maintain absolute authority over every aspect of their lives. During my 14th month, a conversation with Grace Morrison, the veteran elder who had become something of a mother figure to me, shattered what remained of my illusions about the organization's true nature. We were alone in the community center kitchen after a particularly long meeting, cleaning dishes and putting away folding chairs, when Grace suddenly broke down crying with an intensity that frightened me. "Linda Sue," she whispered, looking around frantically to make sure we were completely alone. "I need to tell someone before I lose my mind completely. I've lost both of my children to this organization's policies, and I don't think I can pretend anymore that it's God's will." Grace had been a pillar of the community for over 30 years, one of the most respected and devoted members, someone whose faith and dedication were held up as examples for newer members like me. But behind her composed public facade, she was carrying a burden of grief that had been crushing her soul for nearly a decade. "My daughter Rebecca was disfellowshipped 8 years ago for marrying a wonderful man who wasn't one of our members," she continued, her voice breaking with each word. "My son David left the organization 5 years ago when he couldn't reconcile the teachings with his conscience after witnessing too many families destroyed by their policies. I haven't spoken to either of them since they left because the organization demands complete shunning of anyone who doesn't conform to their standards." She showed me letters from her children that she kept hidden in her purse, reading them to me through tears that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her heart. Rebecca had written about her beautiful marriage and the grandchildren Grace would never be allowed to meet, expressing her love for her mother despite the forced separation. David had become a successful teacher and was volunteering with homeless shelters, living out Christian principles of love and service in ways that would have made any mother proud. But Grace was forbidden from acknowledging his existence or celebrating his accomplishments. "Sometimes I sit by the phone for hours wanting to call them," Grace admitted. "But then I remember what happened to Sister Davis when she was caught maintaining contact with her disfellowshipped daughter. Sister Davis had been publicly humiliated and nearly expelled herself for the crime of motherly love. Her weakness announced to the entire congregation as a warning to others who might consider putting family bonds above organizational loyalty. They tell us that shunning is loving because it might shock our children into returning. But it's been 8 years, Linda Sue. 8 years of birthdays and holidays and graduations and heartbreaks that I've missed. How much of my children's lives am I supposed to sacrifice for a policy that clearly isn't working? Grace described the toll this forced separation had taken on her mental and physical health, the depression and anxiety that she had to hide from other members who would interpret her suffering as evidence of spiritual weakness or hidden sin. She told me about other families in similar situations, about suicides that had been covered up to protect the organization's reputation, about young people who had developed severe mental disorders due to the constant psychological pressure of knowing that one mistake or moment of independent thinking could cost them every relationship they had ever known. "My own grandchildren don't know I exist," she said, "and I don't know if they ever will. But if I try to contact them, I'll lose what little community I have left here too. They've created a system where love is impossible and isolation is guaranteed, no matter what choice you make." Grace was sharing this devastating confession with me as both a cry for help and a warning, giving me a glimpse into the future that awaited me if I continued down this path of increasing involvement and dependency. She was showing me the true price of absolute obedience to an organization that claimed to represent divine love while systematically destroying the most fundamental human relationships that give life meaning and purpose. The breaking point arrived during my 16th month, when I discovered that the organization maintained detailed surveillance files on every member's personal life, including intimate information shared during supposedly confidential counseling sessions with the elders. This revelation came through Jennifer, the young mother I had watched being psychologically tormented at the regional assembly for seeking professional help for her depression. She approached me after a meeting with hands shaking and eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperate courage. "Sister Hartwell," she said, glancing around to ensure we weren't being observed, "I need to show you something that I think you should know about." She pulled out several pages of handwritten notes that an elder had made during private counseling sessions about her marital problems she had shared in confidence while seeking spiritual guidance for the difficulties she and her husband were experiencing in their intimate relationship. The notes contained explicit details about their sexual life, her struggles with depression following childbirth, private confessions about doubts she'd experienced regarding certain organizational teachings, and even speculation about her spiritual fitness based on her reluctance to participate in certain congregation activities while dealing with postpartum depression. I only found out about these notes because my husband was asked to clean the elder's office and accidentally saw them, Jennifer revealed. But when I confronted Brother Williams about it, he told me that keeping detailed records was necessary for providing proper spiritual oversight, and that questioning their methods showed dangerous independent thinking. The violation of trust was staggering, but even more disturbing was learning that this wasn't an isolated incident, but standard practice throughout the organization. Every private conversation with elders was documented and filed away, like evidence in a criminal investigation, creating detailed psychological profiles that could be used to control behavior or silence dissent when necessary. "They know everything about everyone," Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Every weakness, every doubt, every private struggle, every family problem. It's all written down and stored in files that they can access whenever they need leverage over someone." She told me about other members who had discovered similar documentation of their private lives, information that was being used to monitor compliance and ensure absolute loyalty to organizational policies. The knowledge that my own private conversations with Martha Wilson and other leaders had been documented and cataloged like evidence against me made me feel violated and betrayed in ways I'd never experienced before. Every moment of vulnerability I'd shared while grieving Jim's death, every confession about my struggles with loneliness and depression, Every question I had asked while trying to understand their teachings, all of it, had been recorded and filed away as potential ammunition to be used against me if I ever stepped out of line or showed signs of independent thinking. The organization that had presented itself as a source of spiritual comfort and emotional support was actually operating like a sophisticated intelligence agency, collecting detailed information about its members' psychological vulnerabilities, family dynamics, financial situations, and personal secrets to maintain control through fear of exposure and social destruction. I realized that there was no privacy, no confidentiality, no safe space within their structure where a person could be genuinely human without being monitored and judged. Every moment of honest communication was being weaponized against the very people who had trusted them with their deepest fears, greatest hopes, and most intimate struggles. The beautiful promises of unconditional love and eternal paradise were revealing themselves as bait in an elaborate trap designed to capture not just bodies in meeting seats, but minds, hearts, and souls for purposes that had nothing to do with genuine spiritual growth or divine worship. This discovery marked the beginning of my final awakening to the true nature of what I had become involved with, and the start of my desperate search for a way to escape from a system that had slowly but systematically stripped away my ability to think independently, love freely, or maintain authentic relationships with anyone outside their control. The awakening accelerated during my 17th month, when I witnessed a devastating example of how the organization's supposed love was entirely conditional on members' ability to contribute financially to their ever-expanding operations. The Washington family had been faithful members for over 12 years, with Mark Washington serving as a ministerial servant, and his wife Linda coordinating the congregation's charitable activities for needy members. Their 3 children had been raised in the organization and were considered exemplary young people who participated enthusiastically in all congregation activities. But when Mark lost his position at Indiana University due to budget cuts, and the family fell behind on their monthly financial contributions to the organization, they became targets of subtle but unmistakable social punishment that revealed the true priorities of their supposed spiritual family. During meetings, pointed comments were made about the importance of supporting God's work, even during difficult times, with not-so-subtle implications that faithful members would find ways to maintain their contributions regardless of personal circumstances. Elder Johnson spoke repeatedly about how God always provides for those who put kingdom interests first, suggesting that financial struggles were evidence of insufficient faith or misplaced priorities. The psychological pressure was relentless and cruel, directed at a family that was already struggling with the stress of unemployment and mounting bills. Their teenage daughter Sarah came to me in tears after being excluded from a congregation outing because her family couldn't afford the entrance fees to the amusement park where the group was planning to spend the day. "Sister Hartwell," she sobbed, "they say God provides for those who are faithful. But what does that make us? Are we unfaithful because my dad can't find work? Are we not worthy of friendship because we can't afford to go everywhere the group goes?" The sight of this intelligent, kind young woman being made to feel worthless because of her family's temporary financial difficulties crystallized everything that was wrong with the organization's twisted version of Christian love. I watched as the Washingtons' worthiness as human beings was systematically measured by their ability to donate money to an organization that already possessed vast wealth, accumulated through decades of member contributions and property investments. The cruel irony was that the organization taught extensively about Jesus' concern for the poor and his criticism of religious leaders who placed financial burdens on struggling families. Yet they were implementing exactly the kind of policies that Christ had condemned in the religious authorities of his time. Mark Washington, a devoted husband and father, who had given 12 years of faithful service to the organization, was being treated like a spiritual failure because economic circumstances beyond his control had temporarily reduced his ability to contribute financially. During one particularly painful meeting, Elder Johnson announced that the congregation needed to increase its monthly contributions to support new construction projects at the organization's headquarters, and his eyes seemed to linger pointedly on the Washington family as he emphasized that true Christians find ways to sacrifice for God's work, regardless of personal challenges. The public humiliation was subtle but unmistakable, and I could see the shame and hurt in Mark's eyes as he realized that his years of faithful service meant nothing if he couldn't maintain the expected level of financial support. This wasn't spiritual community, but financial exploitation, disguised as religious devotion, a system that extracted money from people who barely had enough to meet their family's basic needs, while the organization's leaders lived comfortably on the donations of struggling members. I began to understand that I had traded my intellectual freedom for an illusion of belonging, my moral autonomy for the promise of paradise, and my authentic relationships for membership in a counterfeit family that measured love in dollars and obedience rather than genuine care and mutual support. The realization that everything I had been taught about their values was a carefully constructed lie designed to maintain financial and psychological control over vulnerable people filled me with a combination of rage and profound sadness for all the sincere individuals who had been deceived just as thoroughly as I had been. The definitive break came during my 18th month, when I made the conscious decision to refuse their demand that I cut off all contact with Susan Henderson, the devastated mother whose family had been destroyed simply for her son's intellectual honesty and her own parental loyalty. When the elders discovered that I had been secretly providing emotional support and practical assistance to this broken woman, they summoned me to appear before a judicial committee meeting that felt more like a criminal trial than spiritual counseling. 3 men sat behind a folding table in the stark, windowless back room of the community center, their faces grim and disapproving as they prepared to sit in judgment of my conscience and my basic human decency. Elder Johnson, Elder Williams, and Elder Thompson had arranged themselves like judges in a courtroom, with notebooks open and pens ready to document my responses to their interrogation about my spiritual rebellion. Sister Hartwell, Elder Johnson began in a tone that was both stern and condescending. Your continued association with a disfellowshipped person shows a dangerous spirit of independence that threatens the unity and purity of God's organization. You were clearly instructed to have no contact with the Henderson family, yet you have deliberately disobeyed this direction from those whom Jehovah has appointed to shepherd his flock. My disobedience consisted of bringing groceries to a woman whose family had been financially devastated by their sudden expulsion from the community, of listening to her cry about losing her son to policies that prioritized organizational control over parental love, and of offering the basic human comfort that any decent person would provide to someone suffering such profound loss. When I tried to explain that my conscience wouldn't allow me to abandon a person in desperate need, they informed me that personal conscience must always be subordinated to organizational loyalty. That individual moral judgment was dangerous pride that had led to Satan's original rebellion against God's authority. The organization is God's channel for moral guidance, Elder Williams explained with the patience one might use with a stubborn child. And your unwillingness to accept direction shows the same independent spirit that caused Adam and Eve to fall from paradise. Your sympathy for Sister Henderson is misplaced emotion that interferes with the discipline that may be necessary for her spiritual recovery. They painted my compassion as weakness, my empathy as dangerous sentiment that undermined God's purposes, my basic human decency as spiritual rebellion that threatened the welfare of the entire congregation. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. They were asking me to believe that ignoring a suffering mother was somehow loving, that abandoning someone in crisis was spiritual maturity, that following my conscience was actually disobedience to God Himself. "If you continue this course of action," Elder Thompson warned, "you will face the same consequences as those you're supporting. We cannot allow one person's emotional attachments to compromise the spiritual welfare of the entire congregation." But instead of the fear they expected their ultimatum to produce, I felt an enormous wave of relief washing over me, like a cool breeze on a stifling summer day. For the first time in 18 months, I could see with crystal clarity exactly what choice I was being asked to make, and the decision was suddenly beautifully simple. They were demanding that I choose between my humanity and their authority, between love and control, between my God-given conscience and their manufactured interpretation of divine will. The choice had never been clearer, and I knew with absolute certainty which path led toward truth and which led toward spiritual death. I stood up from that uncomfortable metal chair, looked those three men directly in their eyes, and said with a strength I didn't know I still possessed, "Then I choose love." Walking out of that sterile room and through the doors of the community center for the last time, I felt like I was breathing freely. For the first time in a year and a half, like I was finally returning to myself after a long and terrible captivity that had nearly destroyed everything I truly valued about being human. Today, as I sit in my living room on Maple Street at 83 years old, surrounded by photos of the family and friends who never stopped loving me, despite my temporary journey into spiritual captivity, I can hear that familiar polite knock echoing through my house on Saturday mornings, and my heart still responds with a complex mixture of emotions. But instead of anger or bitterness toward the sincere people standing on my front porch, I feel profound sadness for individuals who, like I once was, are victims of a system that exploits humanity's most basic needs for belonging, purpose, and hope. I understand now that on the other side of my door stand people who genuinely believe they're offering salvation and eternal happiness. People whose own minds and hearts have been captured by the same sophisticated manipulation that nearly destroyed my ability to think independently and love freely. Through my 18-month experience with that organization, I discovered truths about spiritual freedom that the previous 65 years of my life had never taught me with such painful clarity. True spirituality, I learned, doesn't require us to abdicate our capacity to question our moral autonomy or our family relationships in service of any human institution, no matter how confidently it claims to speak for God. Authentic faith doesn't isolate us from the world, but connects us more deeply with our shared humanity, encouraging us to love more broadly rather than more narrowly, to think more critically rather than less independently, to serve others freely rather than from compulsion or fear. Real spiritual community supports our growth as complete human beings, rather than demanding that we surrender essential parts of ourselves to maintain membership in good standing. That's why I keep my door closed to those who offer salvation in exchange for freedom of conscience, who promise paradise in return for intellectual surrender, who claim that love requires us to abandon basic human decency in service of organizational loyalty. But that same door remains always open to those seeking genuine human connection based on mutual respect, shared authenticity, and the recognition that every person possesses inherent worth that doesn't depend on conformity to any group's demands for absolute obedience. I've learned that the most dangerous prisons are often those that feel like home, that the most effective chains are frequently forged from our deepest longings for love, acceptance, and spiritual meaning. But I've also discovered that freedom is always possible for those willing to pay its price. That it's never too late to reclaim our right to think independently, to question boldly, to love without conditions imposed by those who claim divine authority over our consciences. My 18 months in that organization taught me more about the precious value of intellectual and emotional freedom than the previous 65 years of my life had ever revealed. Sometimes we must lose ourselves completely to discover who we truly are beneath the layers of others' expectations and demands. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is having the courage to walk away from those who claim to speak for God, but whose actions contradict everything that genuine divine love represents. Sometimes preserving our integrity requires us to stand alone rather than compromise our souls for the illusion of belonging to a community that loves only our compliance, not our authentic selves. Today, at 83 years old, I'm more spiritually alive than I've ever been because my spirit is finally free to grow, to question, to love, and to serve in ways that honor both my Creator and my own God-given capacity for moral reasoning. The scars from my experience remain, reminders of how easily any of us can be manipulated when we're vulnerable and searching for meaning. But those scars have also become sources of wisdom that I hope can help others recognize similar spiritual traps before they become as thoroughly ensnared as I once was. Every Saturday morning when I hear that polite knock, I say a prayer for the people on my doorstep, hoping that someday they too will discover the joy of authentic freedom and the peace that comes from loving without conditions, serving without compulsion, and believing without surrendering the precious gift of independent thought that makes us fully human. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I hope my story has touched your heart and opened your eyes to the importance of protecting our freedom of thought and conscience. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us reach more people who need to hear these important messages. Every day we bring you new compelling stories about life, faith, and the courage to choose authenticity over conformity. So feel free to explore and find your favorite. And of course, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Have you ever faced pressure to choose between your conscience and group loyalty? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story that proves it's never too late to reclaim your freedom.